Well, Sir John, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Open Polytechnic today. You have an impressive history as an expert in the areas of open, flexible distance learning and technology-mediated learning, not least your roles as Vice-Chancellor of the UK Open University, the Assistant Director General of Education at UNESCO, and President at the Commonwealth of Learning. Drawing on your experience, what are the benefits open and distance learning have brought to the world, do you think?
Well, clearly the first one is access to education to people who would otherwise not have been able to get it. And that changes over the years which particular groups were the sort of most eager and had been the most deprived. At the very beginning of the Open University, there were large numbers of teachers in Britain who had teaching diplomas but not degrees, and they wanted to get degrees, so they came into the university with terrific enthusiasm. So simply making it possible for those people to study was important. But over the years, of course, there became more opportunities in the conventional system for people to study part-time. So the needs evolve. I think another thing that open and distance learning has done is enabled countries to do sort of crash training programs. My first job in the Tele-University in Quebec, the challenge was to retrain all the secondary school math teachers in what was then called the new math. And so we did this through the Tele-University, and in the space of a few years, the whole of that population was given training in the new maths, which would have been impossible to do any other way, because it's both access and its consistency. These people are getting the same quality of training wherever they were. There were group meetings and all the rest of it. And I like to think that, in fact, the very high performance of Quebec in the PISA student assessment program that the OECD runs is partly due to the fact that these teachers, those many years ago, were all trained rapidly through ODL, and that legacy has stayed on. So those are just, I think, two examples.
Clearly, with the way technology is moving, the field of education is changing somewhat. Open Polytechnic has a 70-year history in ODL. What are some of the strengths that Open Polytechnic might have as the world becomes more technology-mediated in its educational expectations?
Well, I think it's a tremendous asset, because part of the problem in this area is that many people are coming into this area as it becomes more and more fashionable. Assume either that it began the day before they were hired, or at the very most it goes back to the beginning of the internet. And this actually can rather swing your conception of what it's about in unhelpful ways. I always go back to the Adam Smith definition of what technology is about. It's a process, not flashing lights and things that plug in and so on. It's the division of labour, the specialization. So you divide, as they do in an industrial process, you divide a process into its component parts. You specialize in doing each one as well as you possibly can, and then you stick them all together. So in the case of ODL, you'll have people who specialize in doing the learning materials, and they're not just one person. There'll be a combination of an academic who understands the subject, instructional designers, editors, always very important. So all you put those people together, and then other people alongside are designing a student support system. So by the time you finish, you've got quite a large number of specialized functions. The labor of doing the process has been divided up, and then you put them all together, and you can achieve terrific economies of scale, because your learning materials are there, your system for tutoring is there. And what I think also goes with economies of scale, because there's a tendency sometimes to think economies of scale means sort of cheapo, but actually you also get quality of scale, because if you're doing things at scale, you can afford to make a bigger investment in your learning materials, you can afford to construct more robust systems, and also you can make it, and this is perhaps a bit more dangerous to say, independent of individuals. So the course has a life, the student support system has a life independently of the people who might be operating it.
So distance education, though, it would be fair to say, at least in the West, it seems to be out of vogue. A lot of organisations prefer to talk about being online learning developers or being involved in online education. Is that a fair appraisal, and where do you think that might lead if we do ignore the distance heritage?
One of the great problems in the area of educational technology is that it has a fashion for changing vocabulary even greater than almost any other area you can think of. I mean, long before we got to online, people would come into distance learning and they called it distributed learning. Or I mean, I've somewhere did a collection of all these terms that people used because they wanted to pretend their stuff was different. Because in some ways, distance learning, let's face it, had a kind of slightly negative image. So, and after it's not that long ago, we were all talking about e-learning, but suddenly e-learning seems to have been sort of forgotten and everyone talks about online learning. And online learning sounds modern and new and so on. But there are very few of the theories that were valid for good correspondence education that seem to me don't apply absolutely spot on to online learning. It just makes so we can respond faster, we can support better, but the principles seem to me are still very much there.
What are some of the future education challenges facing the developed and developing world? And how do you think distance delivery might actually be part of the solution?
Well, the main challenge facing the developing world is simply a colossal increase in volume. Predictions are what predictions are worth, but there are predictions that you're going to look at 100 million more university-level students around the world over the next 15 years or so. Well, that's an enormous number of students. And to put it in perspective, that is roughly equivalent to tool up for that number of students would require the world to create every day a 30,000 student campus. Well, you don't have to say that to know that it's not happening. So distance learning is going to be the way that many learners are going to have to learn, and therefore there is a terrific opportunity and a challenge ahead.
Well, Sir John, inevitably with a small list of questions, there are often some key themes that are missed out. I wonder if there's anything that's front of mind for you at the moment in terms of distance learning, something that you might like to share in terms of what's important at the moment for those practicing distance education.
Yeah, I think what we have to do is to get people to get real about MOOCs. MOOCs is one of these good news, bad news scenarios. The good news is that MOOCs has made everyone sit up and take notice. I mean, you offer a seminar to university vice chancellors on online learning, and it's full in 24 hours. So this is really front of mind. And that's good because that is in their future, and they better well come to terms with it. That's the good news. The bad news is that those who are coming to it fresh think that MOOCs are what online learning and distance learning is about, whereas in fact your average MOOC is an extremely primitive and simplified form of open and distance learning. First of all, it doesn't carry assessment, which seems to be rather basic to any kind of proper course. Secondly, it doesn't carry student support, which is also basic. But it also gives the impression that distance learning is mostly about nice videos of talking heads of star professors with some rather trivial multiple choice quizzes at the end. And that's very unfortunate because I think over the years we have evolved much more sophisticated systems and we have a much better understanding of how to balance off the various components of the learning system. So there is a danger, I think, that just as the growth of online learning was beginning to give distance learning more credibility, that MOOCs, in a curious way, could take that backwards in that they're alerting people to the importance of it, but at the same time making them understand it in a rather trivial and primitive way. But, life moves on. There are now nearly 4,000 MOOCs available, and some of those, I'm sure, are doing extremely good things in very sensible ways that you and I would recognise as good distance learning.